There are certain movies that whenever you watch them and you see them, it's hard to imagine anybody else besides the person playing the lead role could have played that role. I mean, there are certain movies you watch, it almost seems as if the lead actor were born to play that particular role. So, for example, if you're like me, it's hard to imagine anybody other than Denzel Washington playing Herman Boone in Remember the Titans. Or it's hard to imagine what the movie would have been like if anybody besides George Clooney had played Ulysses Everett McGrant in Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? There's just certain movies just seems to fit that person. But one of the things that's interesting is to think about how often the lead role in certain movies almost went to somebody else. So for example, if you've ever seen the Matrix movies, you might be interested to know that the original plan was for Will Smith to play Neo and Sean Connery to play Morpheus before they finally turned to Keanu Reeves and Lawrence Fishburne. In the great movie Lincoln, the original plan was to have the action star Liam Neeson play Abraham Lincoln. Before that didn't work out, and they finally turned to Daniel Day-Lewis, who the method actor who turned in, the performance of a lifetime. If you're into Christmas movies, the original plan was for Jim Carrey to play Buddy the Elf before they finally turned to Will Ferrell. If you ever seen any of the Back to the Future movies, you might be interested to know that Marty McFly, played by Michael J. Fox. Michael J. Fox was actually the sixth choice on the list to play that particular part behind other more accomplished actors like Johnny Depp, John Cusack, and even Charlie Sheen. One of the more surprising casting choices, though, involves the Indiana Jones series starring Harrison Ford. Now, if you're like me, Harrison Ford has always been Indiana Jones, and Indiana Jones has always been Harrison Ford. In fact, next year there's a new one coming out, and it's a whole big deal because he's going to play Indiana Jones again. It's hard for me to imagine anybody else being cast in that role, and yet according to the people involved in the original production of the movie, the first movie, it wasn't supposed to be that way. Instead of Harrison Ford playing the archaeology professor turned adventurer, it was supposed to be Tom Selleck, the man with the greatest mustache in television history. One of these Sundays I'm going to come in with a Tom Selleck mustache. You guys are going to be blown away. It's going to be unbelievable. Because they had already worked together, meaning Harrison Ford and George Lucas, the writer of Indiana Jones, in the Star Wars series, George Lucas decided, hey, I need a fresh face for this, and he wanted Tom Selleck, but the reason it did not work out is just as they started filming, Tom Selleck had also just started his hit TV show, Magnum P.I., and he was contractually obligated to finish that, which would have pushed the production of the movie back, so they decided to go with Harrison Ford, which obviously worked out for everybody. Now, if you have your Bible or your phone, I want you to turn to John 15. John 15, and we'll get there in just a few minutes. For the last 3 weeks, we've been in this series that we're calling Live a Better Story. And as we've said, there are certain things that every great story has in common. For example, it doesn't matter if you're talking about a book, a movie, a TV show. I mean, every great story has certain things in common, certain elements that they share. And one of those is that every great story has a clear plot. There is a clear storyline. And as you work your way through the book or as you watch the movie, you might not always know where it's going, but you know that it's heading somewhere. Great stories also always include some sort of conflict. There's a mystery that has to be solved. There's a challenge that has to be overcome. There is some tension that has to be resolved. That's part of what draws us in and captures our attention. But the other thing that every great story has in common is they always include a great cast of characters. That's why people who work in the movie industry will tell you that the most important decision a director makes is who will play what role in the story that they're filming. Because if anybody besides Denzel Washington had played in Remember the Titans, it would have been a different movie. And if Jim Carrey really had played Buddy the Elf, it would have come out differently. And if Tom Selleck had been Indiana Jones instead of Harrison Ford, it would be a drastically different movie. But what's true of movies is also true of our individual lives. Just like a casting director has to carefully select the right people to play the right roles, you and I have to be equally selective, if not even more selective, who we allow to become part of our story. Solomon in the Old Testament, Proverbs 13, the wisest man who ever lived, said it like this. He said, "Walk with the wise and become wise, for a companion of fools suffers harm." Now, if there's one verse in the Bible and just a few words that can summarize everything the Bible teaches about relationships, this is the verse. According to Solomon, who you choose to spend time with, who you walk through life with, will more than anything else determine the quality and the direction of your life. And the way he explains it, that's a process that can either work for you or it can work against you. If you choose to surround yourself with what he calls wise people, or people who live carefully, people who are moving in a positive direction, you will almost automatically become wise, because the more time you spend with them, the more you'll become like them. But there's a flip side to that that can work against you, and some of you have experienced that. Notice what he says: walk with the wise and become wise, for, or maybe a better translation would be but a companion of fools suffers harm. Now, in the Bible, the word fool always means somebody who does not live carefully. It always represents somebody who's foolish in what they do. But notice what Solomon says. He does not say that a companion of fools becomes a fool. And the reason he doesn't say that is because it's possible. I mean, it's really unlikely, but it is possible that you could surround yourself with foolish people and not become a fool. You might not fall into the same traps that they've fallen into. But even if you don't necessarily become a fool, Solomon does say, if you're a companion of fools, you'll suffer harm because of your close association with them. Think about it. Have you ever suffered harm because you were too close to somebody who did something foolish? I bet you have. In the military, they sometimes talk about the danger of being hit by shrapnel. You know, a missile or a bomb doesn't have to directly hit you in order to create a lot of damage. All it takes is a few carefully placed fragments to really mess you up. And some of you know what it's like to be on the receiving end of some relational shrapnel. Somebody close to you decided to blow their life up, and you got hit by some pretty significant fragments, even though you didn't do anything wrong. You might have got passed over a promotion. You might have lost your job. You might have had a broken relationship. It might have been as simple as you now have this cloud of suspicion that hangs over you, not because of something you did, but because of something somebody close to you did. It's exactly what Solomon is saying when he says a companion of fools suffers harm. Now, if you were here last weekend, you heard the message, you might be wondering if we're speaking out of both sides of our mouth, because last weekend we looked at Matthew's encounter with Jesus, and you're probably wondering how all this fits together, because in that story, Matthew decides he's going to become a follower of Jesus. He leaves behind his old life, he follows after Jesus, and he invites Jesus over to his house, and the very first thing he holds this dinner party, and he invites Jesus as the guest of honor, and then he invites all of his friends to come and hang out with Jesus, and the problem is that all of Matthew's friends are like him. The Bible calls them tax collectors and sinners, and the religious guys are there, and they're watching this, and they're standing off to the side, and they're critical of Jesus, because these are the very people that they've spent their life trying to avoid. They've tried to do exactly what Solomon talked about, and they want to avoid people who don't live carefully. But yet there sits Jesus, and he's sitting down at the table surrounded by the people that they've spent their life trying to avoid. So the question is, well, who's right in that? Who's doing the right thing? And there's an important distinction that you need to keep in mind as we go through this. In fact, if you have your bulletin, it's the key truth that I want you to write down. And here it is. Choosing your friends carefully is not a matter of being judgmental. Rather, it's using good judgment. Say that again. Choosing your friends carefully, choosing who you're going to allow to be a part of your story is not a matter of being judgmental. It's using good judgment. And those are two different things. Sometimes we get them confused, but they're different. One writer explained it this way. Being judgmental is when I form an opinion about you. It's when I watch you from a distance. It's when I see you interact. I may take just one snippet out of your life, or maybe it's something somebody tells me about, and without knowing you at all, without knowing anything about your story, it's when I take that information, as limited as it is, and I start to draw conclusions about the kind of person you are. That's what being judgmental is. A lot of times all it takes is just one interaction or maybe one secondhand story about one moment from some person's life, and we start forming conclusions about the type of person. Now we hate when people do that to us, and yet we've all done that to other people. And a lot of times what we think we're seeing or what we heard from somebody else about a person might not even be true. It's certainly not the whole story, and yet we draw conclusions. That's what being judgmental is. Using good judgment, on the other hand, is that instead of forming opinions about other people based on my own limited information, using good judgment is when I make decisions about myself based on what I know to be true. And those are two different things. See, as Jesus sat around Matthew's table that day, surrounded by people that were nothing like him, there were two different things going on. First, Jesus knew himself well enough to know that the stuff that they were dealing with was not going to be a temptation to him. He knew himself well enough to know that this was an environment that he could spend time in, and these were people that he could hang out with, and it wasn't going to be tempting to him. And part of using good judgment means knowing yourself well enough to know and understand which environments you can put yourself in and be okay, and which environments you need to avoid altogether based on what you know to be true about yourself. But here's the second thing that was happening, and throughout his life, Jesus modeled this for us, that there are different levels of relationships. I've got a graphic I want to show you that may help this. Now, I just broke it down into 3 categories. A lot of people break it down into more, but for our purposes this morning, just 3 basic categories, different levels of relationships. If you look at this, on the outer edge of this circle, these are people that you care about. This could be a large group of people. It could be anywhere from 150 people, up to a couple of thousand people. These are people that you're acquainted with. They might be your friends on Facebook. You might have gone to high school with them. Your kids might play on the same ball team that their kids play on. And at some level, you care about what happens to them. If you hear something bad's happening to them, you're going to pause for a minute and you're going to think, you know what, that's too bad. And again, depending on your social habits, that might be anywhere from 150 up to a couple thousand people. The second group of people, though, and this much smaller group of people, are people that you have some level of influence over and have some level of influence over you. And sociologists tell us that number will be less than 150. For most people, it'll be closer to 50. These are the people you work with, people that you've known for a long time, people who've been a part of your life. Maybe they're people, at one point you were really close to them, but then you moved or they moved. You still talk occasionally. Maybe you still grab dinner or grab lunch or whatever it is you like to do. But that's a smaller group. And in that last group, that intimate group, much smaller group, these are your most intimate friends. These are the people that will cry at your funeral. And just so you know, that's a much smaller number of people than most of us think. You're going to have 2 or 3, maybe 4 people outside of your immediate family that when you pass away, they're really going to be devastated by it. These are the people that know things about you that nobody else knows. These are the people that when something good happens to you, you can't wait to call and share the news with them. These are also the people that when something bad happens, they're the first people you call. These are the people who are having the most impact on who you are and who you're becoming. And to borrow the words of Solomon, these are the people that if they're wise, you'll start to become wise. But if they're foolish, eventually you'll suffer harm because of your association with them. Back in 2017, there was an interesting study published by Northwestern University under the direction of a neuroscientist named Moran Cerf. For 10 years, he and a group of grad students and researchers studied what they called engagement, which they defined as how decisions are made in the context of relationships. And what they discovered by watching the brain scans of thousands of people as they interact with one another is that as people engage with one another, their brain waves actually start to mirror each other. You've heard it called being on the same wavelength. It's actually a real thing. I want you to look at this quote with me. He described it this way. He said, "The more we study engagement, we see time and again that just being next to certain people actually aligns your brain with them." This means the people you hang out with have an impact on your engagement with reality beyond what you can explain. And one of the effects is that you become alike. We had a really large crowd first service. When I read that, there were a handful of people that got up and changed seats just because they did not want to be next to the person. They did not want to become like the person they were next to. I mean, this can either work for you or this can work against you. It just depends on who you hang out with. And so that's why the same thing that Dr. Surf said is the same thing that Solomon said. You need to be careful who you engage with on a deep level, because eventually you're going to start to think like they think, and you're going to start to view the world like they view the world. That means it's not a matter of being judgmental as to who you allow to become a part of your inner circle. It's simply a matter of using good judgment. Jesus did this throughout his life. On the outer edge of the circle, Jesus had these huge crowds of people, and he cared about them, and at some level, they cared about him. Those would be the people that were sitting around Matthew's table that day. But then on that second level, Jesus narrowed it down. There were just 12 men and another handful of close friends, and these are people that he had more influence over, and they had more influence over him. And then at the most intimate level, right in the middle of that circle, Jesus narrowed it down even further, and he had this group of 3 men, and you see this all throughout the New Testament: Peter, James, and John, 3 of his apostles, the smaller group within that medium-sized group, and these are the people that he was closest to. You see him over and over again, taking them aside, showing them things, explaining things to them that he didn't share with anybody else. So in one sense, they were his best friends, and they served as his inner circle. Now here's what's really cool about this. Decades later, long after he had grown to be an old man, one of the guys who had formed part of Jesus' inner circle, the Apostle John, looks back on his time spent with Jesus, and he writes these verses in John 15 in which Jesus paints us a picture of what friendship is supposed to look like. Now, some of you are familiar with John 15. The first 8 verses, Jesus talks about the key to long-term spiritual growth is that you remain close to him. He calls it abiding in him. But then you get down to verse 9, and he switches gears just a little bit, and he says, it's not just remaining in him that will help you grow spiritually. It's who you choose to surround yourself with. So he models for us the importance of using good judgment when it comes to choosing your friends. Check out the way Jesus said this, John 15, verse 9. As the Father has loved me, so have I loved you. Now remain in my love. If you keep my commands, you will remain in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commands and remain in his love. I have told you this so that my joy may be in you and that your joy may be complete. My command is this: love each other as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. You are my friends if you do what I command. I no longer call you servants, because the servant does not know his master's business. Instead, I have called you friends, for everything that I learned from my Father I have made known to you. You did not choose me, but I chose you and appointed you, so that you may go and bear fruit that will last, and so that whatever you ask in my name, the Father will give you. This is my command: love each other. So if you had to choose a cast of people, an all-star cast, to be a part of your story, what kind of people should you be looking for? And Jesus answers that question by pointing to 3 things. So here's the first one. Our closest friendships, the people who are part of our inner circle, that should be built on a foundation of sacrificial love. One of the things that makes this passage so powerful is the setting in which it takes place. So as Jesus speaks these words, he and his disciples, that little medium group, are gathered in a place called the Garden of Gethsemane. It's the Thursday night before Jesus will be arrested, or the Thursday night he'll be arrested before he'll be crucified on that Friday morning. So in just a few minutes after speaking these words, these Roman soldiers, along with the temple police, are going to storm into that garden, and they're going to take Jesus into custody. He's going to go stand trial, and the next morning, on Friday morning, he'll be crucified. So you think about the setting, you think about what's getting ready to happen. Jesus is fully aware of all that, and of all the things that he could have talked about. One of the things he does talk about is the importance of his relationship with these guys. And he describes this transition that's taken place in which they've gone from just being his servants to being his friends. And the way Jesus describes it, true friends are people who are willing to sacrifice for one another. He said it like this: love each other as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. Over in another place in 1 John, the Apostle John paraphrased Jesus when he said, this is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers and sisters. So the point is that Jesus willingly gave up his life so that the lives of his friends could be better. Now here's the question. Who do you have in your life that would be willing to sacrifice something so that your life could be better? How about this? Who could you identify and you'd say, you know what, I would be willing to give up this part of my story so that their story could be better? And if you have those people, according to Jesus, those are the people that you want to be a part of your story. Those are the people that you need to draw close to and spend the most time with. You need to surround yourself with people who don't just want something from you, but that want something better for you. Don't spend your life, as much as you can control it, surrounded by people who are always taking and never giving, and whose primary concern is, what's in it for me, as opposed to how can I help? There's a huge difference. And see, for some of us, the reason our stories is not what they could be, and are not what they probably should be, is because we've allowed people to be a part of our circle that aren't willing to sacrifice anything. And from their perspective, it's all about them. Now here's a second thing to note. Jesus also said our closest friendships should also be based on mutual accountability. Now, I've got a picture I want to show you. Earlier I mentioned filmmaker George Lucas. That's him on the right. He's the guy who wrote Star Wars. He's also the guy who wrote all of the Indiana Jones movies, including the one that's getting ready to come out in 2023. The other guy in the picture is another guy you may recognize to the left. That is the famous director, Steven Spielberg. Now, back in 1977, it was just after the first Star Wars had been released, all the hype surrounding that, George Lucas decides, I've got to do something to escape this. So he calls up his longtime rival turned best friend, Steven Spielberg. He says, I'm going to go to Hawaii for 2 weeks, and I want you to go with me. We'll just decompress. We'll have a good time. We won't work. Won't think about anything. So Steven Spielberg agrees. They get on an airplane. They fly to Hawaii. 2 days later, George Lucas begins to talk to Steven Spielberg about this idea that's running through his head that eventually became the story for the first Indiana Jones movie. And the way they tell the story, it took them just 5 days, and George Lucas was able to complete the script for what became that famous movie. When they get back home 2 weeks later, they reach an agreement in which George Lucas has written the story and Steven Spielberg is going to direct the movie. 4 years later, they started filming the movie, which resulted, some of you remember this, they won a total of 5 Oscars in 1982, one of the best-selling, most award-winning movies in history. And it became the first of many of their collaborative efforts that have won all sorts of awards. Back in 2011, Steven Spielberg was asked about what it was like to work with somebody as creative and such a genius like George Lucas. And he said something in that interview that I thought was fascinating. He talked about during the process of filming that first Indiana Jones movies, there were people on the set that were scared to death that he and George Lucas were going to come to blows. He said they would have these heated arguments and, everything short of, punching each other in the face. They would get in each other's faces. They would scream at each other. They would yell at each other. And they would debate how certain scenes should be shot and how certain plot twists should develop. And then he added this. He said this: when George writes a story he believes in, I'm going to shoot the movie the way George envisions it. I'll add my own touches. I'll bring in my own cast. I'll ask him questions to challenge his thinking. I'll shoot it the way I want to shoot it, but I always defer to George as the storyteller. So the way Steven Spielberg describes it, every time he and George Lucas work on a movie together, he takes the story that George Lucas has written, and then he works with George Lucas to do everything they possibly can to make George Lucas's story better. Now here's my question. Who is it that's working with you to make your story better? Who is it that's not afraid to ask you the tough questions? Who is it that's not afraid to get in your face from time to time and hold you accountable to what it is that you say you believe and the type of story that you're trying to write? See, I love the way Jesus put this in verse 14 when he said, "You're my friends if you do what I command." Now, I know it's not popular to talk about, but it's true. If you're a follower of Jesus, if you're a friend of Jesus, there's an expectation that you'll be obedient to what Jesus has said. But to do that, we have to surround ourselves with people who will hold us accountable and help us actually live that way. Proverbs 27, Solomon said, "As iron sharpens iron, so one person sharpens another." And I know it's hard to explain, but some of you have experienced it. There is just something that happens when you have people in your life, people around you who are willing to ask you tough questions, who are willing to put you on the spot, who are willing to challenge your thinking, who are willing to get in your face, that helps you get better in a way that nothing else can. And here's why this is so important. If you were to leave church today and somebody were standing on the sidewalk out here and they were yelling at you as you walk by, telling you to do better, that's not all that helpful. But let me tell you what is helpful. It's when somebody you know, and you know they love you, and you know that they've got your best interest at heart, they sit down across the table from you, and they look you in the eye, and they say, "Hey, tell me about this." Or tell me what you're thinking. Or maybe they even get in your face occasionally and challenge you to change direction. That's what makes the story better. Now here's the last thing. According to Jesus, our closest friendships should also be built around a shared mission. Look what he says in verse 15. He says, "I no longer call you servants, because a servant does not know his master's business. Instead, I've called you friends, for everything that I learned from my Father, I have made known to you." And then check out the next verse, verse 16. "You did not choose me, but I chose you and appointed you so that you might go and bear fruit that will last." Now, a lot of times people read that verse and we get all hung up on that phrase where he says, "I chose you," and we try to make that mean something that I don't think it means. But the phrase that I want you to pay attention to is where he says, I appointed you. Now, to be appointed to something means that you've been selected to fill a certain position, or you've been given a specific assignment. And so what's the assignment? Well, the assignment is to bear fruit, which means to become like Jesus, and then spend your life doing the kinds of things that Jesus did. But in order to fulfill the assignment, and in order to live up to that appointment, you have to surround yourself with people who've been given the same assignment. You remember back when you were in school? I know it's been a while for some of us, so think hard. Two different types of assignments. First, you have what was called an individual assignment. So the teacher calls you up, and here's your paper, and you go solve these problems, you go write this essay, and you turn it back in, and that'll be your grade. But then every once in a while, they'd split the class up into groups of 5 or 6, and they'd say, "Here's your group project." It's meant to teach you to, everybody work together and how to overcome differences and how to accomplish something. And then the group would get a grade together. Big difference between an individual assignment and a group project. But here's the thing. A lot of us make this mistake. We start talking about bearing fruit, and we think that becoming like Jesus is an individual assignment. And we read what Jesus said in verse 16, and we think that he's talking to us as an individual. And so we come up with this plan. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to work really hard, and I'm going to become more like Jesus. And I'm going to pray so many minutes a day, and I'm going to read so many chapters in my Bible, and I'm going to download the right podcast and read the right books and listen to enough sermons and go to enough Bible studies. And somehow in the process of all that, I'm going to turn all my work in, and Jesus is going to give me a grade, and I'm going to become more like him. The problem with that approach is when you look at what Jesus actually said in verse 16, the you is plural. He's not talking to an individual person and saying, hey, I appointed you. I mean, that's the way we read it, but that's not what he's saying. Instead, he's talking to the entire group, and he's saying, I appointed you all. Or maybe a better way to say it, Monticello, would be, I appointed you all, y'all. It's everybody in this thing together. And right from the very beginning of the movement, Jesus knew that the only way for us to become the people that we were created to be, and the only possible way for us to fulfill the assignment that we've been given, is if we learn to do it together. I can't write the story that I'm supposed to write without the right people helping me. And you can't write the story that you were created to write unless you've surrounded yourself with the right people who are all heading in the same direction. Big part of my job on a day-to-day basis is I hear a lot of stories. Some of them are tragic. Sometimes I go home and I think, phew. Other times, and a lot of times, they're incredible stories. And during this series, especially in our Connect groups on Sunday nights, we've done our best to share just a small sample of those stories. Last weekend, we listened to Jeffrey Smith talk about his story, and then today, just before I started, you saw a clip of David and Angie talking about walking through her cancer diagnosis. And if you're in a Connect group tonight, you'll get to hear more of that. As you listen to these different stories, I hope you've picked up on this, and I've heard the four that we filmed now multiple times. There's a theme that just keeps coming up over and over again. You'll hear it, if you listen close. And that's the impact that other people have had on the story. See, most of the time we think, man, my story, it's God and it's me and he's writing the story and I'm the main character and that's how it goes. But that couldn't be further from the truth. Your story is what God wants to do. It's you and it's the other people that he's placed in your life to become a part of your story. And as you heard Angie mention, the very first thing she did after she got her diagnosis was to reach out to the elders of the church, and they got together to pray with her. And you'll hear the rest of that tonight, and she'll talk about how other people were part of that, and some of those people are in this room. But here's the deal. The reason Angie could do that, and the reason she could experience that, is because she already had the circle. She already had surrounded herself with the right people so that when something bad happened, she knew where to turn. But I'll be honest with you. I have a lot of those conversations, and I know that's not everybody's experience. There are a lot of people that when something bad happens, they don't know who to call. And they don't know where to turn. All they know is that they need help, and they're not sure where to find it. Make sure you understand. Overcoming alcoholism is a group project. Walking through a cancer diagnosis, overcoming the death of a loved one, losing a job, going through a bankruptcy, suffering through a terrible accident, standing back and watching as one of your kids goes off the rail. All of those things are group projects. And becoming more like Jesus and bearing fruit that lasts, that's also a group project. See, there are certain things we face as we go through life that we were never meant to face alone. And as hard as it is to accept, you will never wind up in the right place if you're surrounded by the wrong people. And your story will never be as good as it could be, and it'll never be as good as it should be until you pick the right people to play the right roles in the story that you're writing. Solomon said it like this: walk with the wise and become wise, for a companion of fools suffers harm. I want you to stand with me. The band's going to come. We're going to sing a couple of final songs, and as we do, if you're here and you've been trying to do this on your own, I want to encourage you to try a different approach, and it is a better approach. If you want to become more like Jesus, you need other people to help you. So maybe there's some tough conversations you need to have. Maybe there's some invitations that you need to accept. If you're here and you need help figuring that out, Dave and I will be here. We'd be glad to pray with you, to talk with you, help you figure out what your next step should be. Some of you, your next step is really the first step. It's hard to move in a new direction, until you take that first step in a new direction. So if you need to pray with somebody about that, or you've got questions, you just meet us on this front row, and we'll be glad to talk with you.